Welcome to the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast, where leaders across critical industries get the insights, tools and connections they need to be ready for today and prepared for tomorrow. As you advance, your standards rise and your community narrows. That's the nature of leadership. Vaxa Bureau exists to support that journey through credible information, secure products and a critical intelligence hub built for advancing individuals, organisations and the Indo-Pacific. Stay informed, stay operational. The signal starts now. And if you find value here, subscribe, rate the show and share it with someone building the future of critical industry. Aaron, I wanted to move on to another topic around culture, workforce and psychological threats within the sector. How do you think defence and industry can foster a security culture beyond clearance checks and procedures?
That's a good one. We talked about it earlier on in the conversation where there's two really different schools of thought there between defence and industry. So defence are of the view that you get a clearance and, you know, with apart from some other checks, then that's it, you're good until it gets revalidated, which might be, 10, 15 years time if it's baseline, that kind of stuff. Industry takes a more risk-based approach to these things, which might mean that people that are working in defence don't necessarily need clearances because they're not handling classified material. Unfortunately, there's still, I guess, a lack of cooperation between those two mindsets. And I think defence at some point has to, and MOD in the UK has done this and DOD in the US has done this as well. We have to come back to a more risk-based approach to this because not all of the controls necessarily in the Defence Security Principles framework will apply to every business to the same standard because every business is different. So yeah, having clearances and having some policy documents, and that's great. That doesn't really build a security culture. As I said before, you want to bring your staff, and I hate this expression, mate, but you got to bring your staff on the journey. So, explain to them from day one, this is why defence is important to us as a customer, because obviously it provides revenue. We have certain security controls in place in our workplace and on our IT systems because of that relationship we have with defence. Security is very important to us as an organisation, and this is why we're doing this thing. So there's going to be some things you're not going to be able to do, and as I said previously, it's not because we want to make your life difficult from a security perspective. It's because you need to understand and buy into why we're doing this. And I think one thing, I don't know if you've seen these ads, Todd. There's a really good advertising campaign for a company called Anduril.
Yep.
So they're probably not a startup anymore, but they're a $1 billion company set up by Palmer Luckey, who was the inventor of the Oculus virtual reality headset. So they've got really good ad campaigns that are essentially that say, don't work for Anduril, because everybody in that business, and I've had some involvement with them since they started up in Australia, everyone in that place, regardless of their background, is told the importance of defence as a customer. And essentially the importance of what they do to the society we live in, and everyone is bought into that. So they have very few security incidents there. Everyone is committed to the mission, and I think that's what we need to do to drive a more, I guess, security focused culture. Like I would like for there to come a day where we don't talk about security anymore because it just kind of gets done as BAU sort of activities. But the way we get there is to empower staff to manage these kind of security risks and explain to them why we're doing what we're doing from a security perspective.
And that's a good news story, the Anduril story. But mate, what have you seen in your experience, like with psychological vulnerabilities, and where do they exist in the workforce, and how are they being addressed?
Look, I'm probably not the most authoritative person to talk about these, but what I tend to see certainly is we see a lot of people doing multiple jobs, and so people are doing long hours with not necessarily fantastic paying conditions, or they don't have, for whatever reason, they don't have the skills to deliver the work that they're employed to do because the employer is not providing them with training. and that creates its own problems, I think, certainly from a retention perspective. And look, I don't think there's probably an easy fix to that, because I mean, if you talk to folks like Aviation Australia, the skills in the workforce are going down rather than up, unfortunately. So to find people, and you can't just turn the tap on and out come aircraft maintenance engineers or composites manufacturing professionals, that kind of stuff. Yeah, they take years to build. And there's companies like Aeromech that are doing good work to train these kids in high school now around what composites manufacturing looks like, and then what a career pathway is. But that takes time, and so we're probably 10 years behind where we need to be from a workforce skilling perspective across the board. This is not just a defence thing. This is across the economy. Now, if we want to talk productivity, and the government's been talking about a bit of productivity of late, we need to raise productivity somehow. We need to empower our people and train our people to deliver on that, rather than just sort of employers shaking our fists, Monty Burns style, saying, crack those atoms a bit faster, that kind of stuff.
Well, mate, I know we've got a problem down here, but up in India, a population of 1.4 billion people, they can't get enough maritime engineers to service their own fleet. And you're talking about a population of 1.4 billion people. Now, obviously, not everyone's going to be up for the task or have the desire to do that as well. But they're having to send their senior folk to the UK to essentially train the trainer courses.
Yeah, but that's happening here as well. Like it's happening everywhere. So I guess to your point, if India can't do it with 1 billion people, what are we going to do with 30 million?
Yeah, well, and it also puts the AUKUS program into light, or under the spotlight as well, given, especially with submarine building capability, they're struggling in the US to get people to build their own, let alone ours, under the AUKUS program.
That's right.
That's just going to be pushing that back and back. And
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that's, like that sort of leads to that point too, mate. Just putting people on for the sake of putting people on to do things because you think you're solving a problem. But that rapid onboarding bit really, does that create, a sovereign capability problem in developing and outpacing that mindset around secure training and the proper training?
Look, it can. I think if we've got a reasonably robust training regime, then probably not. I'm not going to talk about skills. All I'm talking about is sort of security awareness, why we do what we do, sort of thing. And sometimes you have to bring people on quickly in order to meet demand, and that's fine. But I think if you've got a reasonable awareness or training program in place, and you don't have to belt feed everybody on day one, because they're not going to remember any of that. So it needs to be like a drip feed over the course of the year. And it might be something like so we used to have, when I was at one of the primes, we'd have like a message of the month would go out to all staff, and it was just an email. It would be on the intranet. And we would just pick a topic. Towards the end of the year, you would talk about overseas travel, because all most of our stuff were cleared, and they'd go away for Christmas holidays, because the business shut down for a couple of weeks, so everyone got a break at Christmas time. And then excuse me, so you'd run things like that as well. So you give people, if you're onboarding them really quickly, give them the facts they need to operate from a security perspective, and then tackle the rest of those over the course of the year, because it's not a one and done thing. Because we wouldn't, if we did that from a safety or a fraud and ethics or any other kind of compliance regime perspective, we thought, I've just got one safety brief at the start of the year and then that's it. That doesn't sound right to me. We shouldn't expect it from security either. So as I said, empower people to get on with the job straight away if you're doing this rapid onboarding kind of activity, and then follow up with key points regularly, and make yourself available as a security practitioner. Like, get around the place and talk to people and figure out what they do and how maybe some of your policies and procedures can be tweaked to enable people to do business. So security should be an enabler of business. as a security professional, we should never say no to any kind of proposal unless it's illegal or we're going to breach our contractual obligations. The answer should always be yes, but these are the things that you have to do.
Mate, you touched on a good point there, and policy and then compliance and the reality of that. You spoke of Red Spice earlier. How reforms like the strategic review and Red Spice, affecting, security posture?
From an industry perspective?
Yeah, from an industry's perspective, yeah.
I think, so as I said, Red Spice had an impact, and it's a government program, not necessarily pushing out into industry. So it had an impact in terms of kind of increasing competition for employees. Documents like the DSR and the Defence Industry Development Strategy, those kinds of things, I think, are very useful. And everyone, in the industry forums that I'm a part of, waits on them with bated breath when they come out, and then are disappointed when there's not kind of tons of detail. It says we're going to buy this thing at this time from this supplier. So I think we're in a bit of a holding pattern. I would like to think that would change fairly quickly. I was at the Australian Industry Defence Network conference down the Gold Coast a few weeks ago, and Pat Conroy, the Defence Industry Minister, was there, and he made a couple of really, really good points along the lines of, certainly he gave a few numbers. He said so Sir Angus Houston, when he was the Chief of Defence Force, had 5 defence ministers in his terms as CDF. So far, Pat Conroy has been the only Defence Industry Minister, and Richard Marles has been the only Defence Minister. And so if those two see out their terms, is the second term of this current government, they'll be the longest serving defence and defence industry equivalent ministers since kind of World War II. And what he said comes as a result of that is continuity brings progress from a defence perspective. So I assume he's speaking for the whole of government when he's saying that what they're doing now is because they've been around for so long and they'll continue to be around, they can work on what they call the frozen middle in defence, which is this cohort of bureaucrats essentially who, if they don't like something that the government proposes, then they'll just wait out this current government or this current minister, and then somebody else will come along, and then they'll be able to kind of do what they want or not do anything at all and just kind of sit on their hands again, because by the time they get tapped on the shoulder to say, hey, what's going on with this program, that minister will have gone as well. So I think that the DSR and the Defence Industry Development Strategy, to a lesser extent, the Guided Weapons Explosive Ordnance Plan, there wasn't tons of detail in that, unfortunately. And we really do need a sovereign guided weapons and explosive ordnance capability, kind of now. We don't have time to wait for these things, and we don't have time and the resources to buy them overseas, because as we've seen, and you mentioned this before, Todd, particularly in terms of submarines, if there's a supply crunch or a demand crunch in the US, we're not going to get our the rockets and missiles that have been promised to us by various primes in the US. So I think those documents are a good thing. They provide a bit of direction, but I think what industry wants to see now is some rubber hitting the road in terms of meaningful capability that is going to be procured and will be delivered, without things like Land 400 Phase 3 being continually, that was the infantry fighting vehicle contract, being continually revised down, which, look, I think is a good thing. I don't think we need 450 infantry fighting vehicles, because if we're using 450 infantry fighting vehicles in a conflict, something's gone horribly, horribly wrong. But continuing to rearrange the deck chairs on long-standing contracts like that doesn't provide certainty and doesn't inspire confidence in your sector.
No, and especially when you talk to senior defence personnel, one of my good friends in a senior role down there is mentioned that if defence was a commercial organisation, they'd be trading insolvent. So it's a finance piece, right, as well. So you've got a lot of people, a lot of people wanting to do good things, and whether that's the frozen middle or not, probably not. But you've got people wanting to innovate. You've got organisations like the Australian Missile Corporation and NIA, who are sovereign organisations who have the capability to develop and deliver the GWO.
Yep, absolutely.
But, it then comes down to that risk appetite as well, from defence, to go, right, well, we are going to spend X amount. We're not going to play around with the budgets anymore. We're not going to, move the cards around to make it look like we're spending money, but we're not. They've actually got to get on with it to foster innovation and to ensure that sovereign organisations can get on with the job and do it. But it seems as though that there's all these compliance bottlenecks and innovations being stifled because it's a risk appetite, be it political risk. Am I going to win the next election? And that comes down to Treasury as well and finance. I just don't know. What are your thoughts on? What are you seeing and hearing? I guess from a government point of view as well, in relation to what they would, there's intent, obviously, what they want to do, but what are you seeing or what are you hearing in relation to, innovation and freeing up budget and ability and capability to make things happen?
You make a really good point, Todd. I think there's still a bit of a disconnect between what the government wants to see and what the department is currently delivering. And I think certainly from my perspective, a lot of that comes down to the way defence manages risk or defence's view on risk. Defence has a really strong focus on risk elimination. So, we'll hear terms like zero risk procurement. Now, I can't understand for the life of me how a department as complex and broad as the Department of Defence seems to think they can procure things like helicopters or ships or aircraft or, a cyber range in a box, whatever it is, without exposing themselves to any risk. And so what that does is that ties up, to your very well made point, Todd, that ties up anybody who's looking to deliver these solutions, because the solutions exist. So they're out there now. There are companies that have solutions to, gaps in capability that the ADF needs, but they can't get there quick enough because, or they can't get to the warfighter quick enough, because we're dealing with a procurement organisation who, as you pointed out earlier on in the conversation, Todd, doesn't have tons of commercial acumen, and so therefore doesn't understand how to manage risk. Like their thoughts are, well, if we can get rid of all risk, then this is a good procurement activity. Whereas industry is almost always really, really well placed to manage risk because it's essentially what they do for a living. Defence doesn't understand the basics of risk management, let alone how to do it in practice. And that's not for a lack of trying to educate staff and introducing, risk management programs and frameworks into defence. In my time in uniform, I saw 3 of them come and go without tons of success. I think the reason they weren't kind of engaged with is because they had a hellishly complicated spreadsheet that you had to, work with and kind of provide records of your risk assessment, et cetera, et cetera. And we weren't really telling people why we were doing this. We were just saying, hey, do this thing before you run any activity. We need to, and again, Minister Conroy alluded to this at the Aden conference, where zero risk procurement has to be a concept and a term that is just dead, buried, and cremated. Like, we need to get rid of this from our vernacular.
Well, you look at what it creates, mate. Like, you talk about zero risk procurement, and that obviously there's a big security element into there as well. It's the what if, and you end up with that famous term within defence procurement. You end up with a camel, which is a horse designed by democracy. Then you get nothing that works. It's like, well, we've just wasted billions of dollars on something that doesn't work. We can't use. It's crazy. But mate, look, talking of security and the way forward, so 2025 and beyond, in your mind, mate, what does future ready security look like for defence and industry?
I think, and I've had this view for a while, and the more I engage with industry, in defence, the more it's firming up. I think industry will drive the security standards, one way or the other for the sector, which again I think is a good thing. Defence will, like it always does, play catch up, and they'll be revising policy on the fly, that kind of stuff. Because there's still not tons of consultation with the sector. So, and defence folks that are listening to this will say, "Oh, no, that's not correct. We have, chief security officer forums and these kinds of things." And it's like, yeah, no, they do. But the only people that sit at that table are primes or really big suppliers. So you're not getting feedback from people like we talked about earlier on, Todd, with this kind of uneven playing field in terms of implementation costs. So we're not getting that feedback from people who are having to pay kind of inordinate costs or skewed costs in terms of implementation. So what does future-ready security look like? Look, I think we need to take a more risk-based approach, or a better approach to managing the risk that serving the warfighter provides. And I think that we need to have some basis to say, do these things to a particular standard. I acknowledge that, because some people in this sector too just like being told what to do. So, twiddle this knob, flick that switch, that kind of stuff. And people are, oh, great, I've done that stuff, I'm happy. That is not going to cut it in, an AUKUS / post-AUKUS world. Because it's our partners are doing more than that now. Like they're not just fiddling with knobs and flicking switches and clearing people and then saying, oh, great, well, I've got a lock on my door, everything's tickety-boo, no need to do anything. Security's done, people. We dust our hands off and we walk away. Security needs to be built into everything we do, much like safety is in most organisations. But that doesn't mean it has to break the bank. As I've said a couple of times, there's some really simple things that we can do as a sector to demonstrate that we're secure that are not necessarily implementing a specific control framework. And so I think if once defence as the sector regulator takes a more mature approach to how industry can manage risk, and I'll give you a really silly example, Todd. In a revision to the Defence Security Principles Framework a little while ago, Defence changed the requirement to account for secret material. So once upon a time, everybody, industry, uniform personnel, APS, had to account in a register, so like a ledger, secret documents, secret media, anything that came in or out of your organisation. You generate it, you account for it in a book, that kind of stuff. In the revision a little while ago, that all changed. So industry still had to account for secret material that way in the book, but uniform people didn't. And the question I asked at the time, because I was at a prime, was, well, what's the difference? How are uniform people better risk managers than industry? Like, why don't we have to do it? And then what happens if we provide this, to a uniform member and they lose it? Like, who's responsible for it then? So it's these kinds of things where we just see, controls chucked out essentially at will to go, oh, we don't really trust industry to manage secret material, so we'll make them, put it in a book. Our people, though, we can trust them. They're fine. None of that accepts any of the risk in terms of compromise, because look, I would argue that there are probably more data breaches in defence than there are in industry on any given day. But I think security needs to be built into everything. We need to stop thinking that we do some things. As I said, we put locks on doors, we clear some people, and security is done. So security is an ongoing, enduring business risk. It's not the security guy or girl's problem. Cyber is not an IT, problem. It's a whole of business problem, and it needs to be addressed with a whole of business solution. Otherwise, you and I will have this conversation in 10 years' time.
Well, mate, obviously, emerging tech. It could help solve some of these problems, but also create some conundrums for defence. We last week we spoke with Aquila Earth, and these guys are amazing. They're innovators.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you had to listen to it, but
I did. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Very, very interesting.
But so what they're doing obviously is creating this persistent drone surveillance over bases and forward operating locations, using remote laser charging so that it's continuous surveillance, so it adds to the gates, guards and guns piece, but then there's also the cyber piece, right? So the tech shifts the security equation. So I guess, thinking, are our physical and cyber protections keeping pace, with such advances, but in line with, like you just mentioned, the security procedures moving forward?
Yeah, I think, as I said in the answer to the previous question, we can't just think, we've implemented a couple of controls or we've put a lock on a gate or whatever and security is done. Because as we certainly see, and cyber is certainly a more dynamic kind of threat environment than perhaps physical security is, but the threat is changing on a daily basis. So we've got to come up with, so today's solution is not necessarily going to, neutralize a threat tomorrow. So security is never done, unfortunately. Again, as I said, that doesn't mean you gold plate everything, and you bankrupt your organization because you're super secure. Look, I think that Aquila podcast was fascinating, just in terms of what they're doing. I think the controls for that, I mean, you can work on controls for that from a cyber perspective. So I wouldn't be too worried about how to integrate that. I'm really interested to see how that kind of plays out from a charging perspective. Like how do you secure the infrastructure on the ground to do that? But I think if we treat security as a whole of business problem, then we would start integrating things in terms like security by design as we're writing software code for these kinds of products. And if the war in Ukraine has taught us nothing else, and my good friend James Baker has done a number of trips to Ukraine, and he did an excellent presentation at the Aiden conference a couple of weeks ago. There's been 1,000 tech startups, literally 1,000 tech startups, tech companies, have started up in Ukraine since the war, mostly in around drones and AI, because that is the way of the future from a warfighting perspective. And as I said before, 450 infantry fighting vehicles, great, keeps people employed up here and building them, but they are not going to do what we need to do from a force projection or defense perspective. So we need to start understanding what new technologies are, how they can get integrated into the current order of battle that we've got, and then what's missing, and then get that.
Yeah, and I guess convincing the government to spend the money to make it happen, and trust in industry to get it done without putting up too many roadblocks. But Aaron, I guess finally, what are the top priorities that you'd communicate to defence ministers, defence leaders, and also defence industry CEOs?
I think they're probably two different messages. I think the CEOs, prime CEOs, get it. They want to deliver, top class capability as quickly as they can. Because they've got a vested interest in doing that because they get paid to do it, obviously. But from their perspective, it's the right thing to do. What I would say to defence, and I'll talk about defence as the sector regulator and defence as the kind of procurement organisation. So defence as the regulator, I would suggest, needs to take a more risk-based approach and consult with industry on what works and what doesn't work from a policy perspective. And that doesn't mean that industry gets to bitch and moan and say, oh, we're not going to do any of this stuff. What industry needs to do is come to that conversation with some ideas around what compensating controls might be applicable or could be put in place for, to your point before, Todd, around the implementation costs between primes and SMEs, for example. So is there a way that we could kind of scale? Because from a cyber perspective, certainly in the DISP membership framework, we go from an unclassified system to a classified system at protecting. Now, that's a massive leap. And that's really classified systems are really only the realm of primes, because they've got contracts that mandate it. So there's resourcing to design, build, and run, because they are hellishly expensive. Is there a way to manage, not necessarily implementing all of the top 8 and the essential 8, but we have some other compensating controls in place. I don't know, but we need to have that discussion around what works from a more risk-based approach. And then what I would say to Defence as the contract manager, stop thinking about zero risk procurement. Like, that's a stupid idea, and you need to get that out of your head really quickly, because there are excellent capabilities that exist in industry now, but they will go elsewhere. Like, they will go offshore, because we've got people like Steve Baxter who identify how difficult it is to trade with defence locally. So he and Beaton's own venture partners are looking at supporting people to provide capabilities offshore, which is an excellent idea and an excellent way of doing business. But what it demonstrates is the defence here is not fantastic to work with. And if you've seen Steve speak, as I have, he's very vocal on that topic, which is fair enough. But I wonder whether we should also potentially be talking to the department in terms of maybe thinking about the effect that and we could have another podcast on this, but the effect that a capability generates, rather than saying we need to identify capability gaps, what are the effects that we want these things to generate, these products that we provide to our warfighters? What are the effects that they need to generate by procuring a certain capability? So rather than saying we need 3 Virginia-class submarines, okay, great.
Why?
What is the effect that we want those 3 things to generate? And is there something else around that, that can generate the same effect at a lower cost, can be built locally, those kinds of things.
Mate, that's a great idea. I'd love to catch up with you on that at another time. Mate, your insights today have been absolutely amazing. I do appreciate it. It got me thinking, I wish we'd taken this risk and security-based approach when we were putting on the jersey for St James rugby league team back in the 1990s, before we ran out to get our heads beaten in. But mate, look, thank you so much for that, Aaron. I'd love to catch up again, like I mentioned earlier, mate, but it's really been good having you on the show, bud.
This has been great, mate. Thanks for having me. It's been a long time coming, but I really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of the Vaxa Bureau Intelligence Optimised podcast. If you found value here, subscribe, rate the show, and share it with someone building the future of critical industry. The path of leadership may be solitary, but the future of leadership is coactive intelligence. Be ready for today, be prepared for tomorrow.